Hi, welcome back to Cult Pop. I'm your host, Jim Hall. We've got another really cool show in store for you today. We've got author Jeff Carlson on, and he's written two very cool novels, Plague Year and Plague War. Really cool science fiction thrillers that are modern day kind of tales, and they're just absolutely spectacular. Page turners that you're really going to enjoy, and we're happy to have Jeff with us. Jeff, thank you so much for being with us today on Cult Pop.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's fun.
Jeff, you've really written some page turners, Plague Year and Plague War. We're going to review both books today, and man, just fantastic science fiction, kind of, is it post-apocalyptic? It's apocalyptic type tales that are just absolute page turners. I just absolutely love them.
Well, thank you. It's a lot of fun to write books like this because, you get to blow everything up and everything's on the line and everybody's, wrought with guilt and tension and trauma, and they need to overcome their interior conflict, while you got the exploding helicopters and all this great stuff. So, writing books like this it's a good job. It's great work if you can find it.
Well, Jeff, fans of the website, we get a lot of horror, science fiction authors, in particular, a lot of sci-fi. So people are certainly going to be familiar with the themes of post-apocalyptic, but not necessarily how you went at it. Instead of a nuclear disaster or something like that, we're dealing with nanotechnology run amok, causing all kinds of havoc over the entire planet. And the first book, Plague Year, takes place over a year's time after a nanotech goes completely wrong and just really causes all kinds of trouble. So throwing that out as a start, why don't you tell the folks at home a little bit about the book Plague Year?
Well, I'd been writing professionally for about 5 years before I started working on Plague Year, by which I mean I'd sold a number of short stories, some nonfiction, and I'm one of those guys who always grew up reading a lot of books, and I wanted to play too. This is what even from the second grade, I always wanted to be a writer. I worshipped Stephen King as a kid and all this stuff. I'm also a lifelong skier and backpacker, spend a lot of time up in the mountains. And as a child, I live in California, we used to drive through Donner Pass, just south of Lake Tahoe. And as an 8-year-old boy, I was darkly fascinated by what had happened to this group. And we would drive through there and I would ask questions about it. And my mom, bless her heart, this was to an 8-year-old boy, my mom would say things like, well, Jeff, if we were ever stuck in a snowbank for the whole winter and the only way to stay alive was for, you and your brother to kill me and eat me, I would want you to do that. For an 8-year-old boy, that's pretty crazy stuff, but I'm a father now myself, and I have 2 young boys of my own, and I totally get it. I absolutely get it. I'd throw myself in front of a bus if that's what I needed to do to preserve them. And so mom saying those things, 30 odd years ago, I was like, wow, okay. But I get it now. And spending a lot of time up in the mountains, and especially never wanting to go back to work. My brother and I, our best friends, we'd be up there skiing in Powder for the weekend. And then it's Sunday and you got to pack up and drive back down. We live in the East San Francisco Bay Area, and you have to drive back down from the mountains and, go back to work. And that sucked. And so we started to think, just my imagination, I started to think, what if we could, because sometimes we would call in sick, or we would call in that we had been snowed in. There was too much fresh powder for us to drive back down the mountain. It wouldn't be safe. We had better stay and ski one more day. And so I started to think, well, what if we really couldn't go back home again? And then I'm like, well, what if nobody across the whole planet could ever go home again? And I thought to myself, I'm like, that's a pretty scary, it would be Donner Party everywhere. Originally, it was a short story, and in the short story, it was originally a virus. But I couldn't make a virus obey a barrier. The virus kept, coming up all the way over the mountains and killing everybody. And if everybody's dead, you don't have a story. And I happened on to, I go to a lot of conventions, I read a lot, I meet a lot of just interesting, educated, intelligent people, and I stumbled onto the idea of nanotechnology, in which, of course, if it was a mechanical problem, if it was a machine plague, it might actually have physical limits to it. And they really are using stuff like hyperbaric fuses in labs these days as a control. If the pressure is at a certain level, you would have your lab inside a hermetic chamber, and if, the nanotech happened to get out, of the microscopes where you were working with it, then it would then self-destruct because of the low air pressure in the hermetic chamber. But if somebody, like industrial espionage, I've had a lot of coffee today, as you can tell. If there was an act of industrial espionage and somebody stole that nanotech out through all the safety locks, and then something happened where it broke loose and it began to replicate, and then in my story, it's a hyperbaric fuse and it self-destructs at 70% of an atmosphere, which equates to just under 10,000 feet. And if the only safe places on Earth are above 10,000 feet, things get ugly in a hurry.
Right, and that's where we find ourselves in the novel Plague Year, where each country tries to fight for its own survival, if they're fortunate enough to have land masses above 10,000 feet, which the U.S. has and Canada has, and Russia and other places are fighting for survival in Afghanistan and other mountainous regions. I found it really fascinating the way you wrote that the governments are still intact, they're still fighting for survival, they've adapted, they've relocated, and in the first book, Plague Year, we've still got a space shuttle. One of the real cool things about the book that I enjoyed is that I've always thought about that. What would happen to the people in nuclear subs if something like this happened? What would happen if a space shuttle's going around? Well, we've got people in the space shuttle orbiting the Earth in the space station, and Ruth plays a major part in this book and the follow-up book.
Some of the major themes in the book, of course, are the sense of isolation and the loneliness. I mean, the desolation that's happened down below the 10,000 feet obviously comes into the story, and that sense of loss and distance. But yeah, once you take the premise of the story, that you're only safe and it would be the Sierras, Rockies, Alps, Andes, Himalayas, and then again, you begin to think, as long as you could maintain, that artificial pressure, like the U.S. Navy could survive for maybe months. Up in the space station, of course, as long as they, weren't infected to begin with, they could stay there as long as humanly possible. And then, of course, the scary part is, you have entire countries that don't have any land above 10,000 feet. Britain, Russia just has like a few small mountains, along their border with China and Mongolia. China has almost nothing except for the Himalayas. So you have everybody kind of surging up into these areas, and the geopolitical map is just ripped apart. So you have constant invasions, and most of this stuff is in the background of the first book. The politics and the betrayals and the invasions and just the whole chess game, and who is where and what sort of resources you'd be able to access, because mammals and birds can actually dip back into this invisible sea of nanotech for brief periods of time. And then, of course, you ingest it through your eyes or breaks in your skin, and then it wakes up, and then it starts replicating inside you and starts ripping you apart. But you could go down in containment suits, or you could send, special forces down for 2 hours, and then they have to run back up before, they're hurt too much, internally to survive. And so it's just, it's literally a high concept. And it was a lot of fun to write again, because you have this barrier and people are trying to get beneath it to scavenge supplies and then come back up, and then meanwhile they're trying to do air invasions across these gaps, and there's civil war. And then, as you said, one of the main characters is Ruth Goldman, who's like a super genius nanotech expert that they sent up to the space station at the beginning of the plague, and sent her with as much equipment and supplies and other space crew members to keep her alive and to keep the space station going. And so you just have all these isolated pockets of survivors that are then trying to rejoin and rebuild, and it's kind of cool.
Yeah, well, I absolutely just really enjoyed it. It's a really harrowing novel, and to stick with it a little more, Plague Year was more about the individuals, in my mind at least, I'm going to let you talk, more involved with the individuals fighting this battle and fighting for survival in the year one. As the Plague War, when we go into the next book, we're talking about the whole global implications a lot more, and obviously the war that would then ensue for the battle for land. But in the first book, in War, you had a real great character, and you talked about isolation. Character I wanted to talk about is Cam, who's a young man who's a skier, an avid skier, and knows the mountains in California, and knows about skiing, and he's got some things to help for survival purposes. He's a Latino, and through reading the character, you really like the character, but he's suffered some horrible disfigurement, and that's part of what that nano does to you. If you survive it, if you're exposed too long, it chews up the skin and such. So talk a little bit about Cam and how he must have been dealing with isolation issues of his own, just feeling that he was so horribly disfigured.
Well, you're right. It's interesting. It's interesting that in the books, I mean, this is a global catastrophe. You know, the nanotech gets loose, immediately begins to replicate in the San Francisco Bay Area, spreads east with the wind, you know, covers North America in a couple weeks, gets across the ocean, you know, just, it's catastrophic. I mean, the book opens and 5 billion people are dead. And the funny part is I'm actually a very normal, happy, I mean, I might be like the most well-adjusted, you know, sci-fi thriller writer that you'll ever run into. I've got a beautiful wife, beautiful kids. I'm really happy in what I do. I enjoy my job. But again, once you accept the premise of the book, the idea, I mean, thing is just Donner Party everywhere. And to me, I wanted to get into, you know, there's like this lonely, bitter, beautiful kind of feeling to being stuck. I mean, Cam and his friends are stuck on this mountaintop that's like the size of a couple football fields. And, you know, 80 of them made it up when the plague first broke loose. And then by the time, you know, winter has gone away and they're back to summer, you know, they're down to like 30 people. I mean, this would be absolutely horrific. So you have this, I mean, as a writer, I get to get into the story and analyze all these things and what would be, you know, like the nice character arc and the plot arc and how does it all tie together. And I wanted to get, you know, as far into the characters as I could. I mean, I'm not writing Jane Eyre. These are not like profound, you know, character dramas. I mean, this, you know, things are blowing up and people are chasing each other around. But I do like to think that there's some, you know, some deep human drama in here, because it would be a horrible situation to have to live with. I mean, you have your guilt, you have the survivor's guilt and the trauma. And like you said, I mean, people, you know, they've been scavenging below the barrier, raiding in the ski resort and the nearest cabins just for food. You know, and then the machine plague starts to wake up inside you, and, you know, people are all scabby and scarred. And so you need to overcome not just the exterior threat of the plague, and they're trying to, you know, recover, you know, the original schematics and find the original lab and how can we stop the plague. So you have this exterior plot on many levels, you know, trying to stop the plague, the geopolitical wars, the invasions, World War III. But then you also have this deeply personal story too, where they're trying to overcome the guilt and the trauma and maintain their interpersonal relationships. Well, some of the survivors that they have to rely on are completely insane at this point. I mean, they've been trapped on this mountaintop for 11 months when the story opens, and everybody they know is dead, and, you know, and their pets and civilization, and there's nothing left except, you know, you can see some power lines, you know, off in the distance and maybe a couple buildings. I mean, it would just be, it's pretty dark stuff. The good part with the Ace, my publisher, said, they said, we really like this book. We're going to get behind it. We think it can do better, or we think it will do well. Can you give us more? And I said, well, yes, there are actually a few people still alive at the end of the first book. And so I got to, you know, expand the scope in the second novel. It still almost entirely takes place in the California Sierras and in the Colorado Rockies. Partly because these are places that I know. I've skied there. I have family in both places. I've walked around in these mountains, so I knew I could describe it well. But the scope expands to the war in the Alps and the war in the Himalayas. And I mean, I'm not giving anything away with the second novel and saying that there's a war. I mean, the name of the book is Plague War. There's a plague and there's a war. So I get to expand that scope. And the third book, Plague Zone, is in the bag. It's in the pipeline. It'll be out in November. And again, you know, you're always trying to ratchet up the stakes without I didn't want to get too far out. I didn't want the nanotech. I mean, by the third book, they're developing, you know, bioweaponry based on nanotech, and it's pretty far out stuff. But I didn't want it to be like, you know, death rays and alien science fiction. I mean, these are present day thrillers. This is stuff that really could happen in a couple years. And so I had to, as the craftsman, I had to balance it between upping the stakes, but not getting to the point, you know, where they had nanotech that made people bulletproof, or they could levitate or be immortal or whatever. You know, I wanted it to still be real people dealing with real problems with nanotechnology that was feasible.
Right, excellent. I think you did a great job of that. And something now that we've done a great job of telling people about Plague Year, and I think they're going to want to rush out and get it or go to our website and track it down via our website. And Plague War, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but something really important I'd like to say about it is that they're both great standalone novels. You can read Plague War without reading Plague Year, although I certainly recommend reading both, but if you go to the bookstore and you can only find one available, you know, pick up Plague War. You can read it and then go back and read kind of the history later. As I said, kind of Plague Year is more the individual individuals dealing with the situation in the first year, and the war just ratchets up the action a little bit. And now, as you say, at the end of the year, you're going to have a third novel. But let's talk a little bit more about Plague War and kind of some of the global implications that something like would happen in all the apocalyptic fiction I've read, and most of it, it's more like a Mad Max scenario. Everything's run amok, and there's no organization in the governments at all. What I really liked about this is that most of the world still kept it together as well as they possibly could under such horrific situations. And so I kind of like that aspect of it, that okay, humanity was still able to keep it together, albeit nothing compared to what we would be used to. The movie theaters are gone, life's gone as you know it, it's a battle to survive every day, but the governments try to stay intact. And not only do we fight in Plague War a war with other countries, but kind of a war amongst ourselves.
I really think that
in the United States.
Again, these are very dark novels. They're supposed to be a fun entertainment, but they're pretty dark. But I honestly believe that most people are good and smart and reasonably selfless, and I do think that things would hold together as much as possible. At some point, as you begin to run out of the last bits of supplies, in the FEMA stockpiles and all this kind of stuff, people would turn on each other. And the books are loaded, with the betrayals and the reversals. They're not political studies either, but it comes into the politics and what will you give me? So I'll give you my ammunition if you give me some of your food or your medicine, and this horse trading around. I do think that. I believe in America and the government and our system and all this kind of stuff. I do think that they would be able to hold things together as long as possible. In the books, Leadville, Colorado becomes the U.S. capital. It's not really much of a city, but it's the only city in the U.S. that's above 10,000 feet. It's like 10,154 or something like that. And so there would be infrastructure there in place, and it's surrounded by highways. You could be bringing in C-130s and C-17, Globemasters, and landing supplies and troops and government. And there would be major problems. You'd have everybody out of Denver and probably, Utah and Arizona too, flooding up into the Rockies. You'd have millions of refugees. It would be a very tough situation. But again, I do believe, for me, the books aren't about the gore and the explosions, as cool as those are. Exploding helicopters are awesome. But for me, it's about, the grit and the intelligence and the determination and perseverance of the human being. These are all the things that are best in us. And again, as the craftsman, it's fun to push the characters, good guys and bad, as far into the corner as possible. Because I especially like smart bad guys. One of the things that makes me nuts about books and films is stupid bad guys, or even stupid good guys who do dumb things simply to further the plot. And when I'm writing the books, I get to play both sides of the chessboard. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, if I was the bad guy, if I was the Russian ambassador, if I was the senator with aspirations towards the presidency, the presidentship, what would I do? What are my assets? What are my liabilities? How would I position my troops? How would I try and outsmart the good guys? Because the bad guys never think that they're bad. The bad guys always have good reasons, or should have good reasons, for doing what they do. So for me, it was fun to get into everybody's head and think about, again, how do I outsmart the other side? And then I had to outsmart myself and then re-outsmart myself, because I'm playing all sides of the chessboard. I think the center would hold at least as long as possible. It's much more interesting that way.
Yes, and it makes for just thrilling novels. Now, we've talked about Plague War. You were nice enough to send us a really nice promotional video that is very cool and kind of talks a little bit about the book, shows it what it's all about. So let's take a look at that, and then we'll come back and talk more with Jeff Carlson.
Please.
see what I have to go through to write books like this? Welcome to the world of the machine plague. I literally developed this concept from the top down. I'm a lifelong skier and backpacker, and as a writer, I'm always looking for cool ideas. My friends and I never wanted to have to go back to work, and I began to think, what if I couldn't go home again? And then I took it a step farther. I thought, what if no one could ever go home again? What if no one could survive below 10,000 feet? The nanotech in the book is very, very real. The machine plague could happen tomorrow. And if it did, do you think you could run from here to there in a day? The geopolitical map is obliterated. China invades the Himalayas, Russia takes Afghanistan, and everyone in Europe fights for the Alps. Leadville, Colorado becomes the new US capital. There is famine and war, and the environment is crashing worldwide. There's no shelter up here, and barely any fuel. There are no animals to hunt, there are no plants to eat, and the only people who survive are the strongest, smartest, and fastest. You find anything?
The Plague Year series by Jeff Carlson, in stores now.
Okay, folks, if that doesn't get you to want to buy the book Plague War, I don't know what will. Plague Year and Plague War, really, really page-turners. Again, we're with Jeff Carlson, author of Plague War and Plague Year. Jeff, some folks at home, after we've seen that great video of Plague War, I think people are already going to be picking that up. Some folks at home might know you from your short stories. So we've got a couple of minutes left. Why don't you talk about some of the short stories you've written for like Asimov and some of the sci-fi publications, and then talk a little bit about your website so people can find out more about you.
Well, I got started writing short fiction, which is often kind of, especially in genre writing, is a classic way for writers to get started. You know, you're honing your craft, you're writing your ability to, you know, do the plot arc and the character arc and have it all come together and pay off at the right point in the story. You know, you start off, you're just getting nothing but rejection letters. Hopefully, you know, you're learning from your mistakes. The editors start giving you personal notes back, try and fix this, or I will buy the story if you rewrite the middle. And I think that writing short stories is really hard. Trying to do an entire story in 40 pages, you know, where the plot arc and again the character arc come together and the light bulb goes off in the character's head and it all pays off in the space of 40 pages is really, really hard. But some of my heroes growing up, you know, were Joe Haldeman, John Varley. These are guys who write good, crisp, tight, mind-croggling, you know, short fiction with the big ideas. And I mean, that's what I wanted to do too. I grew up wanting to write that stuff too, and was fortunate enough to. I mean, I've had a couple stories in Asimov's now. You know, won the Writers of the Future contest and was in that anthology. You know, I know Lou Anders over at Pyre Books now had a story in the Fast Forward 2 anthology, and it's absolutely, it's just mind-croggling now to, you know, to share a table of contents with the guys that I grew up, admiring. Connie Willis, Jack McDivitt, Joe Haldeman. I get to just hang out with these guys now, which is it's amazing. I'm not writing a whole lot of short fiction these days because writing is, I do this full time and I have a mortgage and I have kids, and short stories don't really pay a lot. But I do have a story, upcoming in the December issue of Asimov's, which is a lot of fun. I do it just like when I'm in between stories. I'm working on my 4th novel now. Had a story that I wanted to bang out. Was pretty sure that Sheila over at Asimov's would buy it. She did. It'll be out. It's fun. Maybe someday I'll have enough for a short story collection. They have to be big collections these days, so I need a couple more short stories to write to get there.
Okay, well, I'm always trying to get the fans out there, all the available venues to track down authors, and I know you've got some short stories worth tracking down, so folks will know how to do that now, and we can be on the lookout for Asimov's. But also, tell the folks at home real quick, we've been showing it throughout the show, Jeff, but tell folks about your website, and like most authors now, you've got a very cool website. You're posting on it constantly, and it's a real nice way to promote yourself, and it's a very cool website. So tell folks a little bit about that while we've got a minute or two left.
Yeah, thank you. The website is jverse.com. That's J as in Jeff, verse as in universe. Got a lot of good stuff there. Got some YouTube videos, got some contests. There's a bibliography there that lists where all of my short stories have been. There's free excerpts of the books. I do try and maintain a blog there. I post the cover art when it's available. You can find the cover art for Plague Zone there, as well as like the German and Spanish editions. I try and have as much stuff available there as a teaser. You get the free stories, the videos, all this great stuff.
Okay, well, excellent. Well, Jeff, we've run out of time. I did want to say to the folks at home, we wanted to talk about more stuff, but these interviews go by so quickly. Check out his website to see some of the covers for some of these foreign editions. They are absolutely magnificent. And you'll see when you go to the website how cool some of these are. And Jeff's got his novels being published all over the world. And so there's some really neat covers and some really neat takes on how this plague zone would look. So it's really neat. So definitely check down his website. Jeff, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've loved your first 2 novels, and I look forward to having you on the show again. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Sure, thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much, folks, for watching Cult Pop. We look forward to seeing you next time.
The world has changed a lot since 1970. That's when Congress created the Securities Investor Protection Corporation, SIPC. For 37 years, we've remained focused on one thing: helping investors in the unlikely event that their brokerage firm encounters difficulty. We've helped more than 600,000 investors recover over $14 billion in assets. We're the Securities Investor Protection Corporation. There for you then, here for you now.